As I prepared for my introduction for this week's message, I knew that I wanted to speak a little bit about mobs, about riots and such. And actually, if you want to, there are so many historical examples of a mob going out of control or a riot that ends in huge tragic loss that I had a lot of choices. And so I just picked two to highlight to remind us of this. One from recent memory. It's been less than a year since Charlottesville, Virginia, August 11th and 12th. There were a large number of white nationalists, neo-Nazis, Klansmen, and the like who had gathered ostensibly to protest the removal of a statue to Robert E. Lee. They clashed with the counter-protesters, the people that showed up to protest their protest, which is the modern way of doing things. You can't have one protest without having two. In the end, 30 people were injured and 3 people were killed because of that demonstration and the violence that it brought. But that's not certainly the first racially tinged riot in United States history. You might not have heard of this one, but there was a riot in Philadelphia on May 6th to 8th, and then again July 6th to 7th, 1844, known as the Nativist riots. It was an anti-Irish riot and an anti-Catholic riot. It began when the false rumor was spread, and you'll find this interesting, that the Catholics were trying to remove the Bible from public schools. That was the rumor, that the Catholics didn't want the Bible in public schools. And people believed it, enough people. In the end, multiple Catholic churches were burned to the ground. 3 people were killed and 23 people were wounded. But of course, there were others I could have mentioned. Watts in 1965 left 34 people dead. Detroit in 67, Chicago in 68. Or LA in 1992, which left 53 people dead and 1,000 buildings burned. There are all sorts of examples of riots and mob action in history based on class, upper class versus lower class and vice versa, based on anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitic sentiment, and religious disputes, politics, all sorts of things. But one common theme is often present in these mob actions, in these riots, and we're actually going to see that same thing in our text from Acts today, and that is that they are often spurred on and fed by slander, propaganda, and outright lies. So as we look at Acts chapter 21, our text is 27 to 36. We'll keep that in mind because it's going to come up again. Beginning in verses 27 to 29 of chapter 21, it says this: When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone, everywhere, against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus at the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Our text begins by talking about the 7 days that are nearly over. Let me remind you of the context of where we're at in the book of Acts. Paul has just returned to Jerusalem following his 3rd missionary journey, a very successful trip of founding and strengthening churches in Asia Minor and Greece, and now he has come back to Jerusalem. He has one particular goal in mind that drove him on to go back to Jerusalem, and that was the goal of building and strengthening harmony between the Jewish Christians, primarily here in and around Jerusalem and Judea, and the Gentile Christians that he is familiar with from the churches that he founded. He wants to bring the two groups together. And the text says the 7 days are nearly over. Those are the 7 days. We left off with this in our last message in Acts. Paul was asked by the leaders of the Jerusalem church. When he arrived, they said, Paul, there are some rumors about you. There are some slanderous ideas about you being spread, and we need to counteract that. So what we want you to do is pay for the fulfillment of the Nazirite vows of 4 of your fellow Jewish men, and be seen with them fulfilling those Nazirite vows. And so he went into the temple and he fulfilled that requirement in furtherance of the idea of building up harmony between the two groups. That's Paul's purpose, that's why he's here, that's what he's trying to do. But we see that he needed to do that because there were already things being said about him that weren't true. There were already people in Jerusalem that wanted to get rid of him. And so we see that there were some Jews from the province of Asia. You're thinking, well, what are you doing here in Jerusalem? Remember that this is taking place at Pentecost. So some have come from far away to celebrate the feast in Jerusalem. Remember also that the last time Paul was in Asia, in Ephesus, there was a riot there. That was a totally different reason. On that occasion, Paul was caught up in a riot because he was ruining the idol-making business of the men in Ephesus that made idols for the temple worship there. Obviously, the gospel counteracts that and teaches people that idols are nothing, so they were losing money and they tried to get rid of Paul. Now he's in Jerusalem, and some Jewish people from that same area are out to get him. Now it's interesting because consider these men. These are people who are fervently upset about what Paul is doing. But where do they live? They live outside the Promised Land. They have chosen at some point in their lives, or their family has before, generations before, to leave the Promised Land, to not live near the temple. And yet they are the ones who are so upset about what Paul is doing. They are people who live amongst Gentiles. And they're the ones most upset that Paul is ministering to the Gentiles. It says that Paul was at the temple. Paul was at the temple. And yet, his enemies, those who wanted to get rid of him, had no problem with violating the sanctuary of the temple. Paul was not able, like Quasimodo, to go into Notre Dame and say, sanctuary, sanctuary. He could have, actually, that is in the Old Testament law, if you were accused of murder, you could run in and grab hold of the horns of the altar and demand that they give you a chance to defend yourself in court, so that people didn't just murder you for killing someone. That's not what's going on here, but he was still on sacred and holy ground, and they grabbed him anyway. They didn't wait till he went outside. It says that they stirred up the whole crowd. The ringleaders, the instigators, had no desire to send Paul to trial, to bring evidence and witnesses of whatever crime they think he's guilty of. They chose to start a riot. They chose to rile up the crowd and do this like a lynch mob. So whatever their argument is going to be, whatever they're going to say Paul is guilty of, they themselves are already in the wrong morally by choosing to start a riot to try to solve it. Hard to say that you are on the moral high ground when the way that you go about business is starting a riot. And so what did they say? They shouted, verse 28, it says, fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. This is the heart of the matter. They hated Paul because he taught everyone everywhere. That's enough said. That was a reason for them to want to get rid of him, because he had no distinctions. He did not say, these are the people worthy of God, those are the people not worthy of God, I will only teach the people worthy. Paul went to the marketplace, Paul went to the streets, Paul called everyone everywhere and said, this is the gospel, you must hear it. They didn't appreciate that. It is interesting that those commonly seem most jealous for the church, for the reputation of the church, those that most get often bent out of shape, are the people who belong to it kind of the least. Matthew Henry made that observation about 250 years ago, and it's still true today. It's also ironic that this charge against Paul is more or less the exact same charge that Paul was part of against Stephen. When Stephen was stoned to death for preaching the gospel of Jesus, he was accused of violating the law of Moses and the traditions of our fathers. And now that has come full circle and been used against Paul, saying that he is going against Moses, going against the temple. I also find it interesting that they say he is against our people and our law. But they weren't our people and our law. They're God's people and God's law, not theirs. That's a symptom of the problem of what's going on here. They are zealous for the temple, but they don't live where they can visit the temple regularly. They have chosen the convenience, probably the economic expedience of living somewhere else, and yet they are zealous for the sanctity of that holy place. Of course, not zealous enough for it to avoid grabbing Paul and starting a riot in the temple. And then they said something else. They've already got one charge against him, that he's violating the law, that he's teaching all sorts of people everywhere, and which of course is half true, right? He is teaching everyone everywhere, but it's not a violation of the law, it's a fulfillment of the law. That would be an argument that they could have in a court, right? They could go before a Jewish court and say, is this a violation of the law? Has he repudiated the law by these teachings? Paul could have explained that. He could have spoken to that. But then they added something that was an outright lie. Besides, he's brought Greeks into this temple and defiled this holy place. Now we know that Paul didn't bring any Greeks into the inner sanctuary of the temple. He would not have done that. It's the opposite of what he's trying to do, right? He's trying to build up harmony between these two groups, and that would have been an act of rebellion. That would have been spitting in their eye. That's not what Paul was about. That's not what he's going to do. So we know that this is completely a lie. Now, in parentheses, the narrator tells us that they saw Trophimus with Paul in the city and assumed he brought him into the temple. There's just enough truth to make the lie believable for those who already want to believe it. And as you know, the best lies, the most effective lies, are the ones that contain a significant amount of truth. This is no different. Now, you're thinking, brought him into the temple. We need to remind ourselves of that. If you remember, the temple has 3 layers. It has an outer layer called the court of the Gentiles. And all the way around the temple, there is an interior wall that is about, and the accounts vary, about 3 to 4 feet high. So not a wall, but more of a barrier that has entrances in it. And at each of the entrances on the barrier, there were signs in Latin and Greek that said, no foreigner is to enter within the balustrade, that's the wall, around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for the death that follows. They've actually found copies of this sign, this stone sign. Archaeologists found it that said exactly that. Josephus reported that it said that, and we found the archaeological evidence. So when they rebuilt the temple, the temple of Herod, they put this wall around it and all of these signs that said, basically, if you're not Jewish, stay out. Sound familiar? Doesn't sound all that unlike the signs that our country had up at times in the past that said whites only, colored bathroom that way, white bathroom this way. Let people know by the sign where they belong and where they don't belong. So this is a sign, I don't mean to reuse the word, it is evidence that their society is struggling and dealing with a sickness of thinking that they're better than the Greeks, that God chose them to be the holy people because they were special. And therefore, even if you are a convert to Judaism, even if you are an Egyptian or a Greek or a Babylonian who is converted to Judaism and worship God, you cannot go into the inner sanctuary. You cannot go in and watch the sacrifices. You must stay at a distance. You can only get this close to God. We can go further because we're better. Certainly a sign that they have that issue, and the evidence of what happens next points it out. Who was Trophimus? We're told that Trophimus was the one that they saw with Paul. He is actually one of the representatives from the church in Ephesus. If you remember, Paul brought with him representatives from the different Gentile churches when he came back to Jerusalem because he had with him a large offering that they had collected from those churches to give to the Christians in Jerusalem because of a famine. So Trophimus came along as a goodwill ambassador, as someone coming here to show kindness and love to the Jewish Christians, only to have the non-Christian Jewish population see him as an enemy and use him to slander Paul. So what happens next? We've got an accusation against Paul. We've got a mob starting to form. Verse 30, it says this: "The whole city was aroused, and people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut." The whole city was aroused. You got to wonder in a situation like this, did even 1 in 10 people that came running know what's going on? They hear a tumult, they hear a rumor, something's going on, everybody runs to see what's going on. But like any mob, any crowd that gets out of control, most people have absolutely no idea what's really going on. But they come running. It makes me think that there was an awful lot of that anti-Gentile sentiment just below the surface, that the people were waiting for an opportunity to use their racial hatred against their enemies. And the moment they heard Paul has violated the temple by bringing a Greek inside, they come running because their hearts are ready to believe that. They want to believe that they are under attack by these Gentiles. They want to believe that they're the enemy. And so a hint of that, and they come running. And you have a whole crowd coming. Now let it be clear that God cannot be honored by the out-of-control actions of a mob. To act in such a way is not to act on God's behalf. God does not ask his people to be a part of a riot, part of a mob, to be out of control. When are you ever doing the work of God when you're out of control? You're not. That's not the way it works. We know that this crowd is not fulfilling the law of God because they're out of control. We're also told that they seized Paul within the temple and dragged him outside. 2 Kings 11:15. Jehoiada, the priest, would not put to death the wicked Queen Athaliah within the temple. If you remember, we actually saw that from 2 Chronicles a couple years ago. Athaliah was exceedingly wicked. She had seized power, murdered her relatives, and when Jehoiada rebelled against her, he did not let the crowd put her to death in the temple. Said, no, her blood doesn't get spilled in here. Took her outside, and that is exactly what they are trying to do here. They're taking Paul outside of the temple so they can kill him. Can't do it inside. We can't profane this holy place by shedding his blood here. Never mind the fact that we can drag him out of the temple. Never mind the fact that we're going to kill him without a trial, which is absolutely a violation of the law of Moses. There could be no capital case decided without 2 witnesses in the law of Moses. Even if someone was said to have murdered somebody and only one person saw it, they couldn't give him the death penalty. There had to be 2 witnesses. Who were the witnesses that saw Paul violate this rule? Who were the witnesses? They're not going to bring them forth because they don't care about witnesses. They're a mob. They don't care about the law. They don't care about the holiness of the temple. This is all just a smokescreen, all just a convenient excuse for their hatred of Paul and Gentiles. And notice at the end of the verse, immediately the gates were shut. The guys on gate duty knew what was going on. They, as soon as this crowd got out, they shut the gates, put the bar down, and said, it's outside now. They know what happens in a riot. They know that this could spill back in a moment, and they want those gates shut. They want no part of what's about to happen. Verse 31 and 32. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. They're trying to kill him. As soon as he was out of the temple, they wanted his blood. Thankfully for Paul, the Romans had built a fort called the Fortress of Antonia, just adjacent to the Temple Mount. They actually built it on higher ground, overlooking the temple, largely so they could keep an eye on the crowds during the festivals. When the city was jam-packed with people, they wanted to be right where they needed to be if things got out of hand. They actually had a door that opened into the court of the Gentiles, so they could just go, boom, right out there to where the group was. And thankfully for Paul, they were right there. The commander of the troops, his name is Claudius Lysias. You'll actually see about him in 23-26. He's going to write a letter about Paul, but that's all we know about him. We don't know about his character, we don't know about his intentions, but this is his job. There's a riot going on, he grabs the troops, they run out there. What's going on? That's what they do. Notice what happens when the soldiers show up. This is a mob of people who are not being restrained by respect for the justice of God. Care for justice, for the legal system, for the ability of Paul to get a fair trial, that will not stop them. They do not care about those things. Romans with swords, this we care about, because this actually can stop them. What does that say about them? That they don't care about justice, but they do care about their own skin. Nothing good. Verse 33, the second half of that. I already talked about that. Verse 33 and 34, the finale of our text. The commander came up and arrested and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he'd done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. So the commander wants to know what's going on. His assumption is that you are trying to beat this man to death. He must be guilty of a heinous crime. So they bound him. They put Paul in chains, assuming that the crowd wants him arrested and that they're about to tell him what it is that he has done. And so he asked them, Because this is his concern. He doesn't know who Paul is. He doesn't care about Paul. He wants law and order. That's his job. The justice system must prevail. That's the Roman mentality. We can't have a riot. What did he do? And this is completely typical of a group that is out of control. They don't even know the same answer. Some people say Paul did this. Some people said he did that. Some people don't even know that his name is Paul. Some people have no idea why they are there. They're just there. They're caught up in it. They're caught up in the emotion of the crowd, and they can't tell him why they're trying to kill someone. Is that frightening? Does that scare you a little bit? A mob, a riot out of control, willing to kill somebody without even really understanding why. And we see this time and time and time again when riots get out of control. When a group of people go stampeding through a city or whatever, and they grab the first person they see and kill them. They burn the first building they see. There's no rational thought here. It's a mob mentality. And notice, he couldn't get the truth. What is the first casualty of losing control? The truth. The truth was lost. Nobody knows what the truth is. Their emotions are running so high that they are no longer sober-minded, as our text from 1 Peter told us we need to be. They're out of control. So he says, we got to go back to the barracks. We'll get this figured out later. And then finally, verse 35 says this. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed him kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" The crowd was momentarily silenced by the sight of soldiers. But as soon as they started to take Paul away, they flared up again and were willing to beat against the soldiers to try to grab Paul so they could kill him. That violence was still just below the surface. And as they shut the doors of the fortress, they're shouting, "Kill him! Get rid of him! Get rid of him!" The desire for blood. It's a frightening thing. I think there are three things for us to take away from this passage, other than just learning about Paul and what he went through. Number one, I think that this demonstrates something we already know, that we are more likely as human beings to believe rumors and hearsay when they confirm what we passionately believe already than we are to believe verifiable facts if they contradict what we believe. We see this time and time again. People believe what they want to believe, even on the flimsiest of evidence. Somebody shares something on Facebook, you don't even care what website it's from, it says what you already believe, and boom, you share it too. I know it's true because I already believe it. We do this all the time. Mobs do this, teenagers do this, adults do this, people do this all the time. The truth is secondary to confirming my own opinion. And that's a very dangerous thing. As a human being, it's a dangerous thing as a Christian. Secondly, as Christians, we cannot allow ourselves to follow a mob mentality. We cannot allow ourselves to be part of a herd mentality. Just because everybody else is going in this direction does not mean that I should run after them. I need to be sober-minded. I need to be aware. I need to find out what's really going on, to look at the truth of the matter. Churches have been ripped apart and destroyed because of rumors that got out of hand, because people are willing to go off with half the truth and burn something down. As Christians, we have been told to always be self-controlled, to always be sober-minded, to always be in control of ourselves. And thirdly, I think this reminds us of something that we all also know. We need to stop. We need to think. We need to pause. We need to verify and double check and then act. Every time we act before we think, we're in danger. Maybe you, because your action was the right one, but you didn't know that. You acted first and asked questions later. This mob was doing the exact same thing. What? Paul did something? Boom, kill him. Where was the time to consider what was really going on? Very dangerous thing. Once again, as Christians, we cannot allow ourselves to be a mob. We cannot allow ourselves to run out of control. Because if we do, we'll make mistakes that we will regret greatly later.